It was early autumn when Chloe moved into the small, quiet neighborhood just outside of the city. After a messy breakup and the chaos of her previous life, Chloe had decided she needed a fresh start. She found the perfect little cottage tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was everything she wanted: quaint, peaceful, and far away from the noise of her old life. Her new neighbors seemed friendly enough. A husband and wife, James and Margaret, lived directly next door. They were in their late 60s, warm but a little too eager to welcome newcomers. The moment Chloe moved in, they were at her door with a pie and an invitation to dinner. Chloe politely declined, explaining she was still settling in, but James insisted she would come over eventually. His wife, Margaret, was already planning the evening. A few days passed, and Chloe finally gave in. The thought of a quiet dinner with her older neighbors didn't seem too bad. Margaret, she noticed, always wore a warm, knowing smile as if she knew something Chloe didn't. The dinner was pleasant, nothing extraordinary. The conversation was mostly about the neighborhood, the weather, and small-town gossip. But there was something odd about the house itself. The decorations, while beautiful, had a certain old-fashioned charm. In the living room, she noticed a dollhouse sitting in the corner of the room. It was pristine, incredibly detailed, and nearly lifelike. But as Chloe looked closer, she realized it wasn't just a decoration. It was a replica of the entire house. Margaret seemed to notice Chloe's gaze and smiled. "That's James's pride and joy. He built it for me years ago. Every room of the house exactly the same. It's a bit of a family heirloom now." Chloe nodded, trying to mask her discomfort. The dollhouse had a strangely unsettling energy about it, as though it were more than just a dollhouse. But Margaret's gentle smile reassured her, and for a moment, she pushed the thought aside. The next few days felt normal, and Chloe quickly settled into her routine. But something lingered in the back of her mind about the dollhouse. She'd find herself walking by the window, glancing at it, and every time, she'd feel the same inexplicable chill. It wasn't until a week later that things started to get strange. Chloe had been sitting in her living room reading when she heard a soft tapping at her door. When she opened it, she found no one. Only a small, white envelope was lying on the doorstep. Curious, Chloe opened the envelope to find a single note written in a delicate script. "It's time to come see the house again, Chloe." It was unsigned, but the handwriting seemed eerily familiar. For a moment, she thought of James and Margaret, but it didn't seem like something they would do. Why had they sent this to her? Feeling uneasy, Chloe decided to go next door to confront them. When she arrived, James greeted her with his usual warm smile, though his eyes seemed to flicker with something darker. "Everything all right?" he asked casually, as if he hadn't just sent her a strange note. Chloe hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, I was just wondering about the dollhouse. I saw it again, and it's been on my mind." James chuckled lightly. "Ah, the dollhouse. Well, it's not just for show, Chloe. You'll understand more in time. It's a family tradition, you see." His tone had turned serious, and Chloe felt a twinge of discomfort. Margaret appeared behind him, her smile fixed, and the way she looked at Chloe made her blood run cold. "Come inside," she said, her voice a little too sweet. "We'll show you." Inside, the house felt different this time. The once welcoming home now seemed suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Chloe's eyes immediately went to the dollhouse in the corner, and for a moment, it seemed like it had shifted. The furniture was slightly different, and the lights inside the dollhouse flickered in a way that made Chloe's heart race. As Margaret led her to the living room, she pointed to the dollhouse. "Take a closer look, Chloe. James worked hard to make it perfect." Chloe reluctantly approached it. This time, as she peered inside, her breath caught in her throat. She could see her own reflection in one of the tiny windows. But what chilled her wasn't the fact that it was a replica of her own home. It was the scene inside the dollhouse. The dolls had changed. The tiny versions of James and Margaret now looked twisted. their faces contorted in expressions of agony. And there, in the center of the living room, was a small doll, Chloe. But this doll was lifeless, her head twisted unnaturally to one side, her body limp as if something had just happened to it. Chloe stumbled back in shock. What is this? Before she could say anything else, the house seemed to come alive. The lights flickered, and suddenly the dollhouse seemed to expand, growing larger in size. The walls of the living room began to warp, and the room felt as though it was closing in on her. She could hear faint whispers coming from the house, as if the dolls were speaking. "Don't be afraid," Margaret said softly, her smile never wavering. "It's just the way things have always been." James moved toward Chloe, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "We've waited so long for you to see it, Chloe. You were always meant to be part of this." Panic gripped Chloe's chest. She could feel the walls closing in around her, and she stumbled back, bumping into a side table. The lights flickered violently, casting long shadows against the walls, and Chloe's eyes darted to the floor. It was then that she noticed something horrifying. The floorboards beneath the dollhouse had opened, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside there were dozens of dolls, each one eerily lifelike, with human-like features. But as Chloe leaned in to get a better look, she realized they were more than just dolls. They were people. Each one was a miniature, lifelike version of someone who had lived in the house, or perhaps someone who had been invited into it. Chloe's heart pounded as she recognized faces from the neighborhood, faces she had seen around the community, and even her own face among them. James stepped closer, his voice low. "It's been passed down for generations. The house chooses its guests, and we are its keepers." Chloe's mind reeled. "What are you talking about? Why me? Why my face?" Margaret smiled darkly. "You were meant to join us. It was always part of the plan." The terror Chloe felt was indescribable. Her mind was racing, but her body felt frozen, as though the walls of the house were pulling her in. The dolls seemed to move on their own, their eyes blinking, their limbs twitching. Chloe felt her body trembling uncontrollably, the air thick with the scent of rot. Before she could react, the floor beneath her gave way, and she found herself falling. The last thing she saw was the faces of James and Margaret, smiling eerily as they towered above her. She hit the ground hard, but when she opened her eyes, she realized she wasn't in the living room anymore. She was in the dollhouse, trapped inside the tiny walls, surrounded by hundreds of dolls that were once human. They were all staring at her. The room was cold, suffocating. She could hear whispers in the darkness, the same whispering that had haunted her since she first moved in. "You're one of us now," they seemed to say, their voices muffled but unmistakable. And then it dawned on her. The dolls weren't just made to look like people, they were people. And Chloe was the latest addition. Days, or was it weeks, passed in the suffocating confines of the dollhouse. Chloe's body had begun to stiffen, her limbs becoming rigid as though she too were turning into a doll. The whispers continued, louder now, urging her to stay, to accept her fate. But Chloe refused. She screamed, clawing at the walls, but nothing could break through the nightmare that had become her reality. She could hear James and Margaret's voices calling to her from outside, but she couldn't escape. She couldn't leave. The last thing Chloe saw before the world closed in was the face of the doll that looked just like her, smiling back at her. And as her vision faded to black, she realized with horror that the cycle would continue. Someone else would move in, and they would find the dollhouse. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After the breakup, after everything had fallen apart, Andrea decided to move to a quiet neighborhood far from the city. The house was modest, small but cozy, with enough space for her to recover and put the pieces of her life back together. The small street she moved into was lined with neatly kept homes, and the neighbors were friendly enough. At least, they seemed friendly at first. When Andrea moved in, the house next to hers had been vacant for months. There had been rumors circulating about the property, some saying it was cursed, others claiming it was just too expensive for anyone to afford. But that never bothered her. It was just another abandoned house in a neighborhood full of old, dilapidated properties. Or so she thought. A week after she settled into her new home, the house next door suddenly had new tenants. It wasn't much, just a single man and his teenage daughter. They didn't seem like much at first, just your average family. The man, Greg, was a little older than Andrea, probably in his mid-40s, and his daughter, Sarah, seemed to be around 16. They kept to themselves, rarely speaking to anyone in the neighborhood, but that wasn't unusual for people who just moved in. It wasn't until later that Andrea realized there was something wrong with them. Andrea had a pretty normal routine. She worked from home most days, and when she wasn't working, she would go for walks or sit on her porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the quiet. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she started to hear something strange. It started as a faint whisper, so soft, Andrea thought it was just her imagination at first. It wasn't until she was sitting on her porch one evening that she realized it was coming from next door. The whispers were coming from the walls of her house. At first, she brushed it off as the sound of the wind through the trees. Maybe the neighbor was talking loudly, and it was echoing through the thin walls of her home. But the more she listened, the more she realized the whispers were different. They were too deliberate, too clear. She heard words. She swore she could hear her name being called. Andrea. The whispers weren't just random sounds. They were almost like they were trying to communicate with her. The first time she heard it, she thought she was just hearing things. But after a few more instances, she began to dread the moments when the whispers would begin. The longer she listened, the more she heard the whispers turning into something darker. It wasn't just a voice. It was multiple voices, some familiar and others not. Andrea decided to confront Greg and Sarah about the disturbing sounds, but every time she tried, they were never home. That was until one night. It had been an especially eerie evening. The wind howled through the trees, and the usual sounds of the neighborhood seemed quieter than usual. Andrea had gone to bed early, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. But just as she was drifting off, she heard it again. The whispering. Only this time, it was clearer. "Come closer, Andrea. We know you're listening." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to ignore it, but the voice was relentless. It felt as if it was coming from inside her bedroom, whispering directly into her ear, as if someone was standing at the foot of her bed, beckoning her. In a panic, Andrea jumped out of bed, clutching her phone. She tried calling Greg, but no answer. Sarah's room was dark, the window drawn tight. But just as she was about to go back to bed, she caught something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow. A figure standing in the window next door, staring at her. She could see the outline of a man. At least, she thought it was a man. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and he didn't blink. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. Disappeared without a sound. The next day, Andrea couldn't shake the image of the shadow from her mind. She went about her day, trying to ignore the creeping dread that had settled over her. She found herself walking by the house next door, trying to catch a glimpse of Greg or Sarah, hoping to ask them if they had been the ones whispering. As she walked past, she noticed something strange. There was a pile of old furniture and debris by the side of the house. There was also a large, rusted lock on the basement door. It hadn't been there before. Without thinking, she walked over to the door, curious. She pressed her ear to it, and for the first time she heard silence, an absolute stillness. But the moment she stepped away from the door, a soft click sounded from inside, followed by the faintest rustle of movement. Andrea's curiosity got the better of her. She reached for the door handle, and to her surprise, it opened. The basement was dark and smelled musty, but something about the air felt heavy. As she ventured down the stairs, she was almost overcome by the sensation of being watched. The darkness swallowed her whole as she reached the bottom. Then, in the far corner, she saw it. A box, covered in dust, but unmistakably out of place. She knelt down to open it, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, she found old, yellowed photographs. Each photograph had a picture of Sarah and Greg, only there was something wrong. In each photo, their faces were scratched out, as if someone had deliberately erased them. The more Andrea looked, the more she realized these were not just family photos. They were pictures of victims. As she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her. The whispers became more frequent, and they were no longer just at night. They followed Andrea throughout her house, even when she wasn't near the neighbor's home. The walls would vibrate as if trying to speak to her, urging her to come back to the house next door. The more Andrea resisted, the louder the whispers became. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find the basement door wide open, though she was certain she had locked it. And then, one night, it happened. She was sitting in her living room, exhausted from lack of sleep, when she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around. There was Sarah, her pale face and sunken eyes staring at Andrea. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "You need to leave." Before Andrea could respond, Sarah's body jerked violently, as though someone invisible had grabbed her. With a loud snap, her neck twisted unnaturally, and she collapsed onto the floor. Andrea screamed, but the figure of Sarah vanished. The next morning, when Andrea went next door, the house was empty. Days turned into weeks. Andrea never saw Greg or Sarah again, but she continued to feel their presence. The whispers never stopped. They grew more frantic, more insistent. One night, Andrea made up her mind. She was going to confront whatever was in the house once and for all. Armed with a flashlight and a feeling of dread, she entered the abandoned house. The basement door was open. Andrea descended once more into the darkness, her footsteps echoing. And then, she saw it. The entire basement was lined with mirrors, thousands of them reflecting her own terrified face. As she moved forward, a voice hissed from the shadows. "You should have left when you had the chance." The mirrors began to shake, cracking open like shattered glass. From the cracks, hands began to emerge. Dozens of hands, each one clawing at the mirrors as they tried to break free. The last thing Andrea saw was the twisted face of Greg, staring back at her from within the shattered reflections. She couldn't scream. She couldn't breathe. And then, she was gone. Forever. It was a quiet, suburban neighborhood, one of those peaceful middle-class areas where everyone knew each other, waved hello in passing, and helped with shoveling snow or mowing lawns. Kira had just moved into her new home, a charming 2-story house with a white picket fence, the kind of house she'd always dreamed of. The move had been long and exhausting, but it was finally done. She was ready to settle in, find her routine, and get to know the people around her. She was optimistic. The house next door had been vacant for months, and though Kira wasn't one to pry, she had noticed a man had recently moved in. He was quiet, not the type to engage much with anyone, and seemed to keep to himself. He was always in his yard doing yard work, wearing dark clothes and occasionally peering through the window with an eerie intensity. There was something unsettling about him, but Kira chalked it up to her imagination running wild after the stress of moving. Still, there were odd things she couldn't ignore. The lights in his house would flicker on and off at all hours of the night, and there was a faint, foul odor emanating from his basement. Kira was an intuitive person, and despite his friendly demeanor, there was something off about him that gnawed at her. The feeling became more palpable each day. One night, after her evening walk, Kira was coming back home when she saw her neighbor standing outside. She nodded a greeting, and he smiled in return, but it was forced, almost unnatural. "Good evening, Kira," he said in a low, raspy voice. "The house is beautiful, don't you think?" "Yeah," Kira replied, trying to be polite. "Just trying to get settled in." "I've been here a long time," he added. his voice trailing off as if the words didn't come easily. "I'm not used to new faces, but I suppose it's nice." The air between them hung heavy with something unspoken. As she turned to go inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her every move. A week passed, and Kira's unease grew. The noises from the neighbor's house started to get stranger. Late at night, when she should have been asleep, there would be loud bangs, followed by what sounded like dragging, muffled thuds. Sometimes she'd hear a soft scraping noise like someone dragging furniture across the floor. One night, she was woken up by a thud that rattled her window. She sat up in bed, heart pounding. A part of her wanted to ignore it, but her curiosity got the better of her. She went to the window, pulled back the curtains, and peeked out. It was pitch black, but through the darkness she saw the silhouette of her neighbor standing at the edge of his driveway. His head was tilted back, as if he were staring at something in the sky. For a brief moment his body shuddered, and then he turned toward the house, disappearing into the shadows. Kira felt a chill run down her spine. There was something not right about him. Something wasn't adding up. The next morning, she decided to check on him. But when she approached his house, something caught her attention. The front door was wide open. She stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. It felt like an invitation to look inside. Against her better judgment, Kira stepped closer to the door and her heart skipped a beat. Inside, she could see him, her neighbor, standing motionless at the top of the stairs, his face obscured by the shadows. The smell coming from inside was even worse than before, a nauseating stench of rot and mildew. Without thinking, Kira backed away slowly, not daring to make a sound. She rushed back to her house, locking the door behind her. Her thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Over the next few days, Kira tried to ignore the feeling of dread that seemed to settle in her bones. She went about her routine, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen. The odd behavior, the strange noises, the smell, the way he lingered in the shadows. It all pointed to something far more sinister. It wasn't until the next weekend that she got her answer. On a lazy Saturday afternoon, she went out for a walk, the sun shining brightly in the sky. She happened to pass by her neighbor's house again. This time there was something different. His front door was open once again. A figure was standing inside, just out of sight, but there was an undeniable presence. Kira hesitated, but her curiosity got the best of her. This time she walked up to the house. As she crept closer, she could see through the window. The man was holding a large, rusted tool in his hand. The floorboards creaked as he moved, but instead of going upstairs like he had last time, he moved down into the basement. Kira couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was going on. She stepped closer, peering into the basement window, heart racing in her chest. What she saw made her blood run cold. Through the grime-covered window, Kira could see something horrifying. Her neighbor was dragging a large, dark object across the floor of the basement. It was heavy, the dragging sound eerily slow and deliberate. She watched, unable to look away, as the man set the object down with a thud. For a moment, everything was still. But then there was a sudden movement. The object shifted, revealing that it was a body, bloodied and lifeless. Kira stumbled back, her stomach lurching in disgust and fear. She realized with growing dread that the man wasn't just eccentric, he was a killer. Her neighbor was hiding something far darker than she could have imagined. Kira had to act. The horror she'd just witnessed wasn't something she could ignore. She called the police, her voice trembling as she gave them the details. As she waited, she watched her neighbor leave the house looking strangely calm, almost as if nothing had happened. By the time the authorities arrived, the man had vanished. The house was silent, the lights out, but Kira could still smell the stench that lingered in the air, the unmistakable smell of death. The police investigation lasted for weeks, but they found no evidence of the body Kira had seen. It was as though it had vanished into thin air. Her neighbor was never found, and the case went cold. But Kira knew what she had seen. She knew that something terrible had happened in that house, and that her neighbor was involved. In the quiet nights that followed, she often found herself looking out her window, half expecting to see him standing in his yard staring back at her. Though the neighborhood tried to return to normal, Kira could never shake the feeling that the darkness from that house would follow her forever. And to this day, she still wonders if he's out there, waiting,